For decades, I smiled while suffocating. The perfect daughter, a model pioneer, until one spiritual weekend sparked a forbidden question. What if the love I was taught to fear is sacred? Then came the committee, the ultimatum. What they said that night, and what I chose, will shake everything you think you know about faith forever. Today, the smell of coffee brewing in my kitchen this morning brought me back to a Sunday ritual I once knew by heart. But now, instead of rushing to get dressed for a Kingdom Hall meeting, I sit in my favorite armchair, watching the sunlight filter through curtains that Rachel picked out 15 years ago. The magazines scattered on my coffee table aren't the Watchtower and Awake anymore. They're gardening catalogs and art journals, things that bring me joy instead of guilt. My name is Emily Richardson, and I'm 62 years old. For most of my adult life, I was what every Jehovah's Witness congregation holds up as the perfect example. The devoted young woman who never missed a meeting, who spent countless hours knocking on doors, who could recite scripture with the precision of a trained minister. They called me the daughter every parent wanted, the sister who radiated faith and dedication. What they didn't know was that behind that carefully crafted smile, I was slowly suffocating. I live now in a small town in Oregon, about 40 miles from where I grew up in Portland. It's the kind of place where neighbors actually know each other's names, where the local coffee shop saves your usual order without being asked. Rachel and I moved here in 2012 when we finally felt brave enough to live openly as a couple. She teaches 3rd grade at the elementary school down the street, and I volunteer at the community center, helping people who've left high-control religious groups find their footing in what we call the real world. But this story begins long before Oregon, before Rachel and I found our peaceful life together. It begins in the late 1990s, when I was 28 years old, and still believed that the love growing in my heart was the devil's greatest temptation. Back then, my weeks followed a rhythm as predictable as a metronome. Tuesday evening book study at Sister Martha's house, where we'd sit in a circle analyzing Watchtower publications. Thursday evening at the Kingdom Hall for the Theocratic Ministry School, where I practiced giving presentations about Bible topics. Sunday mornings for the public talk and Watchtower study. And Saturdays. Saturdays were for field service, the door-to-door preaching work that defined us as God's chosen people. I was what they called a regular pioneer, committing 90 hours each month to spreading what we believed was the only path to salvation. I carried a small leather briefcase filled with magazines, Bible study aids, and a worn copy of the New World Translation. My approach was gentle but confident. I'd learned to read people quickly. Which ones might slam the door, which ones might invite me in for a longer conversation about their spiritual concerns. "Good morning," I'd say with that practiced smile. "I'm Emily, and I'm visiting your neighborhood today because I have some encouraging news about God's kingdom." The words felt natural after years of repetition, but even then, something inside me was beginning to question whether what I offered was truly encouraging or just another form of spiritual control. My apartment was a one-bedroom place on the east side of Portland, decorated with the kind of modest furniture that wouldn't draw attention or criticism from the elders. A small dining table where I prepared my meeting comments each week. A bookshelf filled entirely with Watchtower literature. No novels, no secular philosophy, nothing that might be considered worldly influence. The walls were bare except for a few framed scripture verses and a photograph from a circuit assembly where I'd received recognition for my zealous service. I shared this space with my roommate, Susan, another single sister in her 30s who worked as a medical receptionist. We were what the organization called good examples. Single women who channeled our energy into spiritual pursuits rather than the worldly pursuit of marriage and career ambitions. Susan was practical and kind, the type of person who always had Band-Aids in her purse and remembered everyone's birthday. We'd pray together before meals, study for meetings together, and encourage each other to stay focused on spiritual goals. But even Susan didn't know about the prayers I whispered alone in my bedroom each night, desperate pleas for God to change something in me that felt broken and wrong. The routine of my spiritual life was interrupted that autumn when our circuit overseer announced that 3 congregations would be attending a special regional gathering. It was the kind of event that generated excitement among the faithful, an opportunity to meet brothers and sisters from neighboring areas, to be encouraged by special speakers, to feel part of something larger than our individual congregations. This weekend will strengthen your faith and deepen your appreciation for Jehovah's organization, announced Brother Patterson, our presiding overseer, during the Thursday evening meeting. I encourage all of you to attend with hearts ready to receive spiritual food. I marked the dates carefully in my calendar, October 14th and 15th at the Assembly Hall an hour south of Portland. Susan and I planned to drive together, along with Sister Martha and her teenage daughter. It would be 2 days of intensive Bible programming, group singing, and fellowship with the broader community of believers. What I couldn't have imagined was that this gathering, meant to strengthen my faith in the organization's teachings, would instead introduce me to a question that would change everything. What if the love I'd been taught to fear was actually the most sacred thing I'd ever experienced? As I packed my briefcase with note-taking materials and my lunch for the assembly, I felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came with spiritual events. I was still young enough to believe that if I followed all the rules perfectly, if I prayed with enough sincerity, if I served with enough dedication, God would reward my faithfulness with the peace that seemed to elude me. I had no way of knowing that this weekend would mark the beginning of the most challenging and ultimately most liberating period of my entire life. The assembly hall buzzed with the controlled energy that characterized large Jehovah's Witness gatherings. Brothers in dark suits and sisters in modest dresses filled row after row of blue cushioned seats, their faces reflecting the particular mixture of anticipation and reverence that marked these special occasions. The air carried the familiar sense of the organization, coffee brewing in the contribution area, the faint smell of new publications being distributed, and that particular combination of cleaning products and carpet that seemed to define Kingdom halls everywhere. I had arrived early with Susan, Sister Martha, and her daughter Jennifer, a quiet 17-year-old who was preparing for baptism at the next circuit assembly. We claimed seats in the middle section, close enough to see the speakers clearly, but not so close as to appear overly eager for attention. This was the delicate balance that governed so much of our behavior, demonstrating spiritual enthusiasm without crossing into what might be perceived as pride or self-promotion. "Sister Richardson," called a familiar voice from behind us. I turned to see Brother Williams, one of the elders from a neighboring congregation, approaching with a woman I didn't recognize. "I'd like you to meet Sister Rachel Morrison. She's recently moved to our area from California and is looking to connect with other pioneers in the circuit." Rachel Morrison was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in the simple style favored by witness women and eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't immediately read. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, but somehow different from the practiced expressions I was accustomed to seeing at these gatherings. There was something unguarded about her, something that suggested she hadn't yet learned to carefully monitor every word and gesture for organizational approval. "Emily pioneers in the downtown territory," Brother Williams continued. "She's been an excellent example for our younger sisters, and I thought you two might have much to discuss about the ministry work." "It's wonderful to meet you," Rachel said, and her voice carried a slight California accent that made familiar words sound somehow fresh. "I've been looking forward to establishing new friendships here. The brothers in my previous congregation spoke so highly of the spiritual atmosphere in Oregon." We spent the next few minutes in the polite conversation that preceded these assemblies, discussing our respective territories, comparing notes about effective presentation techniques, sharing experiences from recent door-to-door work. But even during this conventional exchange, I found myself noticing details that seemed somehow significant. The way Rachel's eyes lit up when she described helping a Bible study student understand a difficult concept, the genuine warmth in her laugh when Sister Martha shared a humorous story about a householder's response to our message. The opening song began, and we took our seats. Throughout the morning program, I was aware of Rachel sitting 2 rows ahead and slightly to my left. During the intermissions, she would turn to scan the audience, and occasionally our eyes would meet. Each time, she would offer a small smile that seemed meant specifically for me, not the general pleasantness that witnesses distributed equally among all their spiritual siblings. The first day's program focused on strengthening our commitment to the organization's teachings. Speaker after speaker emphasized the importance of loyalty to God's visible organization, the danger of independent thinking, and the necessity of complete submission to the guidance provided by the governing body. These themes were familiar, comfortable in their predictability. I took careful notes, underlining points that seemed particularly important, preparing to incorporate these insights into my personal study routine. But I found my attention repeatedly drifting to Rachel. During one of the talks about maintaining spiritual focus, I watched her lean forward slightly, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. When the speaker made a point about avoiding worldly influences, she paused in her note-taking and appeared to be thinking deeply about something. There was an intensity to her concentration that intrigued me, as if she was processing these familiar teachings through some framework I didn't understand. During the lunch break, Rachel approached our group with her own lunch bag. "Would you mind if I joined you? I'm still learning my way around, and familiar faces are always welcome." "Of course," Susan replied immediately. "We were just discussing this morning's program. Brother Henderson's talk about maintaining spiritual vigilance was particularly timely." "Yes," Rachel agreed, but I detected a slight hesitation in her voice. "He made some interesting points about the importance of personal Bible study. I sometimes wonder how we balance organizational guidance with our individual relationship with God." It was a carefully phrased comment, the kind that could be interpreted as either deep spiritual insight or the beginning of dangerous independent thinking. Sister Martha responded with the expected affirmation of organizational authority, but I found myself studying Rachel's expression more carefully. There was something in her eyes that suggested this question wasn't merely academic. The afternoon program continued with talks about family life, Christian marriage, and maintaining moral purity. During a presentation about resisting worldly temptations, the speaker made particular mention of what he called unnatural desires that could lead faithful Christians away from God's righteous standards. The language was coded but clear to anyone familiar with organizational teachings about homosexuality. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied these discussions, the uncomfortable reminder of feelings I'd been struggling to suppress for years. As the speaker continued, I found myself glancing toward Rachel, wondering what she was thinking, whether she felt the same discomfort I experienced whenever these topics arose. After the session ended, Rachel appeared beside my seat as I was gathering my materials. "Emily, I was wondering if you might have time to continue our conversation about the ministry work. Perhaps we could meet for coffee sometime this week." "That would be lovely," I replied, surprised by how quickly I accepted. "There's a quiet cafe near the Kingdom Hall that's perfect for discussing spiritual matters." "Wednesday evening? After the meeting?" "Perfect." As we walked toward the parking area, Rachel fell into step beside me. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you seem like someone who thinks deeply about spiritual things. I've been looking for friends who share that quality." "Thank you," I said, though I wondered what she had observed that led to this conclusion. "I do try to approach my relationship with Jehovah seriously." "Good," she replied, and something in her tone suggested she meant more than simple approval of my spiritual dedication. That evening, I lay in bed thinking about the day's events. The assembly had been typical in its content and structure, but something felt different. Perhaps it was simply the excitement of meeting someone new, someone who seemed to share my commitment to spiritual growth. Or perhaps it was the way Rachel had looked at me during certain moments. Not with the general Christian love that witnesses were trained to display, but with something more personal, more curious. I told myself that my anticipation for Wednesday's coffee meeting was simply the natural pleasure of developing a new friendship within the organization. But as I drifted toward sleep, I couldn't ignore the small voice wondering whether there might be something more significant about this connection, something that would challenge everything I thought I understood about myself and my faith. The second day of the assembly would bring more conventional programming about staying loyal to organizational teachings. But something had already begun to shift in my carefully ordered world, though I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge what that might mean. Wednesday evening's meeting felt longer than usual. I sat in my customary seat in the third row, trying to focus on Brother Peterson's presentation about maintaining Christian neutrality, but my mind kept drifting to the coffee appointment waiting afterward. Rachel had arrived precisely on time and taken a seat across the aisle, 4 rows back. Every time I glanced over my shoulder during song breaks, she was there with that same thoughtful expression I'd noticed at the assembly. The Watchtower study proceeded with its familiar rhythm of questions and carefully rehearsed answers. Sister Martinez raised her hand to comment on paragraph 12 about avoiding worldly associations. Brother Thompson offered his usual lengthy response about the importance of spending time only with those who shared our spiritual values. Through it all, I found myself thinking about friendship boundaries, about what constituted appropriate Christian fellowship, about lines I'd never questioned before. "Let's conclude with song number 43 in prayer," announced Brother Patterson at exactly 9 o'clock. As the congregation filed toward the exit, Rachel appeared at my side with the timing of someone who'd been carefully watching for the right moment. "The cafe you mentioned, is it walking distance?" she asked as we moved with the crowd toward the doors. "Just 3 blocks north. Harmony Coffee. They stay open until 10 on weeknights." "Perfect. I'll meet you there in 10 minutes?" Susan caught my arm as we reached the parking lot. "You're not coming straight home tonight?" "I'm having coffee with Rachel, the sister I met at the assembly. We're discussing ministry approaches." "Oh, that's nice. She seems very spiritual." "Don't stay out too late. You have field service in the morning." The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived, just a couple of college students with laptops and an older man reading a newspaper. I chose a corner table away from the windows, the kind of spot that felt private without appearing secretive. Rachel appeared 5 minutes later, having changed from her meeting dress into jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, less formally witness-like. "I ordered tea," I said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure what you preferred." "Tea is perfect. Thank you for suggesting this place." She looked around the small space with its mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. "It feels comfortable, peaceful." We began with safe topics: her move from Sacramento, the differences between California and Oregon congregations, her adjustment to a new territory in the ministry work. But gradually, our conversation began to move toward deeper waters. "Emily, can I ask you something personal?" Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more intimate register. "How long have you been pioneering?" "About 6 years now, since I was 22. "And you've never married? Never been close to marriage?" The question touched something tender, something I'd learned to deflect with practiced responses about putting spiritual goals first. But something about Rachel's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than the judgmental probing I'd grown accustomed to from other sisters. "I've never found the right person," I said carefully. "The brothers I've known have been good men, but—" I paused, uncertain how to finish that sentence honestly. "But you've never felt that spark, that sense of deep connection?" "No, never with—" I stopped myself before saying, "with any of them," realizing that phrase would lead to questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Rachel nodded, as if my incomplete response told her something significant. "I've been married," she said quietly, "to a brother in my previous congregation. We divorced 2 years ago." This was surprising news. Divorce among Jehovah's Witnesses was rare and complicated, requiring extensive investigation by committees of elders to determine whether biblical grounds existed. Even then, divorced members faced ongoing scrutiny about their spiritual condition. "I'm sorry," I said. "That must have been very difficult." It was, but it was also clarifying. Sometimes you have to lose something you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. She stirred her tea thoughtfully, and I waited for her to continue. "Michael was everything a witness woman is supposed to want. He was a ministerial servant, regular pioneer, excellent speaker from the platform. Our families were thrilled when we got engaged. The elders held us up as an example of a spiritually minded couple. What happened? We were living a lie, both of us in different ways. I was trying to be the submissive Christian wife, and he was trying to be the spiritual head of household. But underneath all that role-playing, we were strangers to each other. We never really talked about anything that mattered. We never shared our real thoughts, our doubts, our hopes for anything beyond organizational approval." Her honesty was startling. I'd grown so accustomed to conversations that stayed on the surface, that dealt only with acceptable spiritual topics, that this glimpse into someone's authentic inner life felt almost shocking. The marriage ended when I finally admitted that I couldn't keep pretending to be someone I wasn't. Michael deserved better than a wife who was going through the motions. And I deserved She paused, choosing her words carefully. I deserved to discover who I really was underneath all those expectations. And what did you discover? She looked directly at me for a long moment, and I felt something pass between us that I couldn't name but also couldn't ignore. That's still a work in progress, she said softly. But I'm learning to trust my own heart instead of constantly second-guessing my feelings. We talked for another hour about less charged topics. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, simple pleasures we enjoyed outside the routine of witness life. But that earlier exchange had opened something between us, created a foundation of honesty that made every subsequent conversation feel more significant. As we prepared to leave, Rachel touched my hand briefly. Emily, would you like to have dinner this Saturday? I'm making pasta and I'd enjoy the company. That sounds wonderful. Good, I'll give you my address. Come around 6? Walking to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. There was something about Rachel's presence that made me feel more like myself. Not the carefully constructed witness version of myself, but some more authentic person I'd almost forgotten existed. Saturday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made Portland feel almost spring-like despite the October date. I spent an unusual amount of time choosing what to wear, finally settling on a blue dress that I'd bought but never worn because it seemed too fitted, too flattering for the modest witness standard I usually maintained. Rachel's apartment was in a complex near the university, a spacious one-bedroom with large windows and walls covered with photographs and artwork that definitely didn't come from witness publications. Books filled every available surface, not just Watchtower literature, but novels, poetry, books about psychology and philosophy that would have raised eyebrows in any Kingdom Hall library. This is beautiful, I said, accepting the glass of wine she offered. Wine with dinner wasn't unusual among witnesses, but something about the setting made it feel more sophisticated, more worldly, in a way that excited rather than worried me. Thank you. It's the first place I've lived that actually feels like me. She'd prepared linguine with homemade sauce and fresh bread, simple food that somehow tasted more complex than anything I'd eaten in recent memory. We talked about our weeks, our upcoming assignments in the ministry school, the seasonal changes that made autumn in Oregon so spectacular. But as the evening progressed, I became aware of subtle changes in the atmosphere between us. Rachel would let her hand linger when she refilled my wine glass. When she laughed at something I said, she would lean closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, see the small scar on her chin that she'd gotten as a child falling from a bicycle. Emily, she said as we cleared the dinner dishes, can I tell you something that might sound strange? Of course. I feel like I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time. Not you specifically, but someone like you. Someone who thinks about things the way you do. I set down the plate I was holding and turned to face her fully. What do you mean? You question things. I can see it in your eyes during meetings, the way you pause before answering, the way you really consider what's being said instead of just accepting it automatically. Is that bad? It's honest. It's brave. It's rare in our organization. She stepped closer, and suddenly we were standing near each other in her small kitchen in a way that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Rachel, I should probably head home soon. Early field service tomorrow. Of course. But Emily? Yes? I hope we can do this again soon. I hope we can keep talking about real things. Driving home, I felt as though I was balancing on the edge of something precipitous and exhilarating. For the first time in my adult life, I'd spent an evening with someone who made me feel completely seen, completely understood. It was a feeling I wanted to protect and explore in equal measure. But I also knew that what I was feeling ventured into territory that the organization considered dangerous. Close friendships with the potential for emotional intimacy were discouraged, especially between single women. The elders taught that such relationships could lead to inappropriate dependencies, could distract from spiritual goals, could even open the door to the kind of immorality that brought severe discipline. Over the following weeks, Rachel and I began meeting regularly after evening meetings. Always in public places, always with the stated purpose of discussing spiritual matters or ministry techniques. But our conversations increasingly moved beyond safe organizational topics toward questions that felt more personal, more authentic. "Do you ever wonder," Rachel asked one evening as we walked through Laurelhurst Park after the book study, "whether there might be more than one way to serve God?" "What do you mean?" "Whether the organization's way is the only way. Whether God might be working through other people, other religions, other paths that we've been taught to dismiss." These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that led to judicial committees and possible disfellowshipping. But they were also thoughts that had been surfacing in my own mind with increasing frequency. "I've wondered," I admitted, "but questioning the organization feels like questioning God. But what if it's the opposite? What if questioning human institutions is exactly what God wants us to do?" One evening in early November, as we sat in her car after a circuit overseer's visit, Rachel reached over and took my hand. It was the first time we'd touched deliberately, intentionally, and I felt something electric pass between us that had nothing to do with simple friendship. "Emily," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between us like a confession and a question and a challenge all at once. I knew I should pull my hand away, should remind her of organizational standards about appropriate relationships, should suggest that we pray together for God to help us maintain proper boundaries. Instead, I found myself saying, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." That night, for the first time in my life, I understood what people meant when they talked about love as a force that could reshape everything you thought you knew about yourself. It was also the night I realized that everything I'd been taught about love, about righteousness, about God's will, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late November, just as I was preparing for field service. Brother Patterson's voice carried the formal tone that elders used when conducting serious organizational business. "Sister Richardson, the body of elders would like to meet with you this evening after the book study. Please plan to stay afterward." My stomach dropped. In witness culture, such requests could only mean one thing. Someone had observed something concerning about my conduct or associations. I spent the day trying to function normally, knocking on doors with Sister Martinez, discussing Bible topics with householders, maintaining the cheerful pioneer demeanor that had become second nature over the years. But my mind raced through possibilities. Had someone seen Rachel and me holding hands in her car? Had our lengthy conversations after meetings been noticed and reported? Had I said something during a recent gathering that revealed my growing doubts about organizational teachings? The book study that evening felt endless. We analyzed paragraphs about loyalty to God's organization, about the dangers of independent thinking, about maintaining spiritual purity in an immoral world. Each point seemed to land with particular weight, as if the material had been chosen specifically for my benefit. After the closing prayer, the congregation filed out with their usual mixture of spiritual fellowship and practical conversation about weekend plans and family updates. Rachel caught my eye from across the room, her expression questioning. I managed a small smile and nodded toward the door, hoping she would understand that I needed her to leave without drawing attention to our connection. Within 10 minutes, the Kingdom Hall was empty except for me and 3 elders, Brother Patterson, Brother Williams, and Brother Henderson, the circuit overseer who was visiting our congregation that week. They arranged chairs in a small circle at the front of the hall, positioning themselves so that I faced all 3 while sitting alone. "Sister Richardson," Brother Patterson began, "we've asked you to stay tonight because some concerns have been brought to our attention regarding your spiritual condition and your associations within the congregation." "I don't understand," I said, though of course I understood perfectly. Brother Williams opened a small notebook and consulted his handwriting. "Several congregation members have observed that you've been spending considerable time with Sister Morrison, often meeting privately after our meetings and assemblies. We discussed the ministry work. We're both pioneers, and she's new to the area. I've been helping her adjust to our territory and our local procedures." "Sister Richardson," Brother Henderson interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to conducting these interrogations. "We need to be very direct with you. The nature of your relationship with Sister Morrison has raised concerns about whether you're maintaining appropriate Christian boundaries." The room felt suddenly smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher. I could hear the furnace cycling on in the basement, the distant sound of traffic passing outside. Everything seemed amplified, as if my senses had become hyper-aware in response to the threat I was facing. "What specifically are you concerned about?" I asked, though I knew the question would only invite more invasive scrutiny. "We've received reports that you and Sister Morrison have been seen holding hands, embracing inappropriately, and spending time alone together in settings that could compromise your spiritual standing," Brother Patterson said. "We need to know the exact nature of your relationship." I thought about Rachel's hand in mine, about the evening we'd spent talking until midnight about everything except the organization, about the moment she'd told me she was falling in love with me, and I'd admitted the same. I thought about the safety I felt in her presence, the way she listened when I shared my deepest questions about faith and purpose, the relief of finally connecting with someone who saw past the pioneer facade to the person I really was underneath. "Sister Morrison and I are friends," I said carefully. "Close friends." "Sister Richardson," Brother Henderson leaned forward, "we need you to be completely honest with us. Have you engaged in any conduct with Sister Morrison that would be considered inappropriate for unmarried Christian women?" The question hung in the air like an accusation and a trap. I knew that my answer would determine everything that happened next. My standing in the congregation, my relationships with everyone I'd considered family for the past 15 years, my entire social and spiritual framework. "We care about each other deeply," I said finally. "We've supported each other through spiritual questions and personal challenges." "That's not what we're asking," Brother Williams said sharply. "Have you kissed her? Have you touched her in ways that would be considered sexual? Have you engaged in what the Bible calls unnatural practices?" The clinical language felt like violence, reducing something beautiful and sacred to a series of checkboxes on their spiritual disciplinary form. I looked at each of their faces. Men I'd respected, whose counsel I'd sought, whose approval I'd craved for years. Now they sat in judgment of the first genuine love I'd ever experienced. "What Rachel and I share is pure," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "It's based on understanding, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being." "Sister Richardson," Brother Patterson's tone grew more stern, "you're avoiding our direct questions. The organization has clear guidelines about homosexual conduct. If you've engaged in such behavior, we need full disclosure so that appropriate spiritual assistance can be provided." "And if I have?" The question seemed to surprise them. Usually these meetings involved confession, tears, and pleas for organizational mercy. My calm directness was apparently not following their expected script. "If you've engaged in homosexual conduct," Brother Henderson said slowly, "you would face a judicial committee. Depending on your attitude and willingness to accept help, you might face disfellowshipping. And what kind of help would be provided? Counseling about God's standards for sexual morality. A program of intensive Bible study to help you overcome these unnatural desires. Possibly a recommendation for professional therapy with a counselor who understands biblical principles." I thought about the young woman I'd been just a few months ago, desperately praying each night for God to remove feelings I couldn't understand or control. I thought about the years of guilt and self-hatred, the constant sense of being fundamentally flawed, the exhausting effort required to maintain a facade of spiritual contentment while dying inside. Then I thought about the woman I'd become since meeting Rachel. More honest, more whole, more capable of genuine love than I'd ever imagined possible. "Brothers," I said, standing up from my chair, "I need to ask you something." They exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about this deviation from their usual procedures. When Jesus spoke about love, about caring for one another, about the greatest commandments being love of God and love of neighbor, was he placing restrictions on what kinds of love are acceptable? "Sister Richardson, you're trying to use Scripture to justify unnatural desires," Brother Patterson said. "The Bible is clear about God's standards for marriage and sexual conduct. The Bible is also clear about not judging others, about showing mercy, about the fruits of the Spirit being love, joy, peace, patience, kindness," I replied. "What I feel for Rachel encompasses all of those things. What you're asking me to do, to deny love, to hate part of myself, to live in fear and secrecy. Where exactly are those fruits in that kind of life?" "Sister Richardson," Brother Henderson stood as well, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. You have a choice to make tonight. You can acknowledge that your feelings for Sister Morrison are wrong, commit to ending any inappropriate relationship, and accept the spiritual guidance we're offering. Or you can persist in rebellion against God's organization and face the consequences. I looked around the Kingdom Hall one final time, the platform where I'd given dozens of presentations, the seats where I'd spent countless hours absorbing teachings about submission and obedience, the walls that had contained my spiritual life for over a decade. This building had been my second home. These men had been my spiritual fathers. This organization had provided the entire framework for understanding God and purpose and community. But standing there facing their ultimatum, I realized that what they were asking me to sacrifice wasn't just a relationship. They were asking me to sacrifice the first authentic piece of myself I'd ever discovered. Brothers, I said quietly, I can't choose the organization over love. I can't choose fear over truth. I can't choose your approval over my own integrity. The silence that followed felt like the space between lightning and thunder, pregnant with the inevitable consequence. Then you're choosing to disassociate yourself from Jehovah's organization, Brother Patterson said with finality. No, I replied, my voice growing stronger. I'm choosing to associate myself with something larger than any human organization. I'm choosing to believe that the God who created love wouldn't condemn people for experiencing it honestly. I gathered my purse and walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. As I reached for the handle, Brother Henderson called after me. Sister Richardson, if you leave tonight, you won't be welcome back unless you're prepared to make significant changes. I turned back one final time. Thank you for helping me understand that some doors, once closed, lead to freedom rather than exile. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean. Rachel was waiting by her car in the parking lot, her face anxious and hopeful. When she saw me, she rushed forward. Emily, what happened? Are you okay? I'm free, I said, and for the first time in my adult life, I meant it completely. The announcement came the following Thursday evening, delivered with the cold efficiency that the organization reserved for its most serious disciplinary actions. I wasn't there to hear it, but Rachel was, sitting in her usual seat in the back section, trying to maintain her composure as Brother Patterson stood at the podium. Emily Richardson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 7 words that erased 15 years of my life from their official records. 7 words that transformed me from a beloved spiritual sister into someone who no longer existed in their carefully ordered world. Rachel told me about it later that evening, her voice shaking as she described the reaction in the hall. The sudden silence, the way people avoided eye contact, the collective exhale of relief mixed with sadness that characterized these moments when the organization removed someone from their midst. Sister Martinez started crying, Rachel said, as we sat in her living room, sharing a bottle of wine that felt both celebratory and medicinal. And Brother Thompson just stared at his hands during the entire rest of the meeting. I felt surprisingly little emotion about the announcement itself. After Tuesday night's confrontation with the elders, the official shunning felt like a formality, the final paperwork for a divorce I'd already emotionally processed. What surprised me was the immediate relief, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. The practical consequences, however, began immediately. My mother called Wednesday afternoon, her voice tight with the controlled grief that witnesses displayed when dealing with disfellowshipped family members. Emily, honey, the elders contacted your father and me. We need to talk about what this means for our relationship. Mom, I'm still your daughter. I'm still the same person you raised. But you're not, sweetheart. You've made choices that put you outside of God's protection. Until you come back to the truth, we have to limit our contact to only what's absolutely necessary. The conversation lasted only 15 minutes, but it established the new boundaries that would govern our relationship. No social visits, no holiday celebrations, no casual phone calls to share daily updates about work or weather, or the small pleasures that had always connected us. Communication would be restricted to emergencies or practical matters that couldn't be handled any other way. My father didn't call at all. Susan, my roommate and closest friend within the organization, waited until Friday to address our living situation. She approached the conversation with the careful preparation of someone who had consulted the elders about proper protocol. "Emily, I hope you understand that I can't continue our current arrangement. It's not that I don't care about you personally, but maintaining a close living situation with someone who's been disfellowshipped could affect my own standing in the congregation." I had anticipated this conversation, but it still stung. Susan and I had shared 3 years of daily life, morning coffee routines, evening study sessions, countless conversations about spiritual goals and personal dreams. She knew my fears about public speaking, my tendency to overthink social interactions, my habit of reading romance novels that I hid behind Watchtower publications. Now, organizational policy required her to treat me like a stranger. "I understand," I said, though understanding didn't make it hurt less. "How much time do I have to find another place?" The elders suggested that a month would be appropriate. That gives you time to make proper arrangements without causing unnecessary hardship. The apartment hunt that followed felt like learning to navigate an entirely new world. For my entire adult life, housing decisions had been filtered through organizational considerations: proximity to the Kingdom Hall, neighborhoods with good witnessing territory, living situations that provided proper Christian supervision for single sisters. Now I was making choices based purely on personal preference and practical needs. I found a small studio apartment 15 minutes from downtown Portland, in a building that housed an eclectic mixture of graduate students, young professionals, and artistic types who seemed utterly unconcerned with my religious background or relationship status. The rent was higher than my previous shared expenses, but the independence felt worth the financial stretch. Rachel helped me move on a Saturday in mid-December, loading my modest possessions into her Honda while snow flurries dusted the Portland streets. Most of my belongings reflected my witness life: organizational literature, modest clothing, simple furniture chosen for function rather than beauty. But scattered among these items were newer additions: books Rachel had recommended, a colorful throw pillow she'd given me, a bottle of wine we'd shared during one of our evening conversations. "This feels like shedding an old skin," I told her as we arranged furniture in my new space. "How does it feel underneath?" "Tender, but alive." The job search proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. My resume reflected 15 years of part-time work designed to accommodate pioneering schedules: cleaning offices in the early morning, providing childcare for witness families, doing bookkeeping for small businesses owned by congregation members. None of these positions had provided the kind of professional experience that impressed secular employers. But Rachel's encouragement helped me recognize transferable skills I'd never considered valuable. Years of public speaking had given me confidence in professional presentations. Door-to-door ministry had taught me persistence in the face of rejection. Organizing congregation activities had developed project management abilities that applied to many workplace situations. After 6 weeks of interviews and follow-up calls, I accepted a position as administrative coordinator for a nonprofit organization that provided support services for homeless families. The work felt meaningful in ways that reminded me why I'd been drawn to pioneer service originally: a desire to help people, to make a practical difference in situations where hope seemed scarce. My supervisor, Jennifer Chen, was a thoughtful woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely interested in my background and perspective. During my second week, as I helped organize a fundraising event, she commented on my unusual combination of skills. "You have this interesting ability to be both detail-oriented and people-focused," she said. "Not everyone can manage logistics while also connecting personally with clients and volunteers." "I spent a lot of years in an organization that required both," I replied carefully. "Religious background?" "Yes. I was very involved in community service through my church. It was the first time I'd described my witness experience in neutral terms, acknowledging the positive aspects without explaining the painful departure." Jennifer nodded approvingly and moved on to other topics, leaving me with the strange realization that my organizational past could be presented as valuable experience rather than shameful failure. The loneliness, however, was more difficult to navigate than the practical challenges. For 15 years, my social calendar had been structured around meetings, assemblies, field service, and congregation gatherings. My friendships had been built on shared spiritual goals and organizational loyalty. Suddenly, I found myself with vast amounts of unscheduled time and no clear framework for building new relationships. Rachel became my anchor during this transition period. She was still attending meetings, still maintaining her standing in the congregation, but she was also questioning everything with increasing intensity. Our relationship existed in a strange liminal space. She was technically still part of the organization that had rejected me, but emotionally and intellectually, she was moving in the same direction. "I can't keep pretending," she told me one evening in January as we walked through Pioneer Courthouse Square after a movie. "Every meeting feels like performance art. I sit there nodding and taking notes, but inside I'm thinking about how much of what they're teaching is designed to control rather than liberate. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. The thought of facing a judicial committee, of going through what you went through, terrifies me. But staying feels like slowly suffocating." I understood her dilemma intimately. The organization demanded complete loyalty, not just outward compliance, but genuine belief in their exclusive claim to divine truth. Once you began questioning fundamental teachings, it became increasingly difficult to participate authentically in worship services and social activities that were built on those very foundations. We developed our own rhythm during those winter months, creating a life that existed parallel to, but separate from the witness community we'd both lost. Sunday mornings, instead of Kingdom Hall meetings, became opportunities for hiking in the Columbia River Gorge or visiting art museums in downtown Portland. Tuesday evenings, rather than book studies, we attended poetry readings at local coffee shops or lectures at Portland State University. Gradually, I began to recognize how narrow my intellectual world had been within the organization. Witnesses were discouraged from higher education, from reading literature that might challenge organizational teachings, from engaging with philosophical or scientific ideas that weren't filtered through Watchtower publications. My new freedom to explore ideas felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. Rachel introduced me to books that opened unexpected doorways, works by authors who wrote about spirituality outside traditional religious frameworks, memoirs by people who had left other high-control groups, poetry that captured experiences of transformation and rebirth. We would spend hours discussing concepts that had been completely absent from my previous vocabulary: feminist theology, comparative religion, the psychology of belief systems. "Do you miss it?" Rachel asked one evening in February as we prepared dinner together in my small kitchen. "The certainty, the sense of having all the answers?" "Sometimes," I admitted. There was comfort in knowing exactly what God expected, in having every decision mapped out by organizational guidelines. But I don't miss the fear. I don't miss constantly worrying about whether my thoughts or feelings were spiritually acceptable. "I've been thinking about freedom," she said, stirring the pasta sauce thoughtfully. "How it's more complicated than I expected. When you're in the organization, you think freedom means getting to do whatever you want. But real freedom seems to be about taking responsibility for your own choices, even when they're difficult, especially when they're difficult." That evening, as we sat together on my small couch sharing wine and conversation, Rachel reached for my hand with the same deliberate intention she'd shown that first night in her car. "Emily, I want to tell you something." "What?" "I love you. Not just romantically, though that's part of it. I love who you are when you're not trying to be what someone else expects. I love your courage, your thoughtfulness, your willingness to choose authenticity over approval." "I love you too," I replied. And this time the words felt completely natural, completely right. "I want to build a life with you. Not hiding, not apologizing, not constantly looking over our shoulders to see who might be watching. What does that look like? I don't know yet. But I know it starts with me making the same choice you made. I know it starts with being honest about who I am and what I want." The following week, Rachel requested a meeting with the elders in her congregation. 15 years have passed since that February evening when Rachel and I decided to stop hiding from ourselves and each other. As I sit in our garden this morning, watching her tend to the tomato plants she started from seeds last spring, I'm struck by how ordinary our life has become, and how extraordinary that ordinariness feels to someone who once believed that love like ours could only lead to destruction. Our small town in Oregon has embraced us completely. Rachel teaches 3rd grade at the local elementary school, where she's beloved by students and parents alike for her patience and creativity. I coordinate support programs at the community center, helping people transition out of various high-control situations, religious groups, abusive relationships, cult-like organizations that promise salvation in exchange for absolute submission. The work feels like a natural extension of my own journey, a way to transform personal pain into practical compassion. "Emily," Rachel calls from beside the garden fence. "Mrs. Henderson from next door wants to know if we can spare some zucchini. Her crop failed this year." "Of course. Take her that big basket from the kitchen counter, Mrs." Henderson is 82, a retired teacher who brings us fresh bread every Sunday and always remembers to ask about my mother's health during our brief Christmas card exchanges. She knows nothing about our religious background, has never questioned our relationship status, simply accepts us as the couple next door who helps with her heavy groceries and remembers her late husband's birthday each year. This is the life I never imagined possible during those dark years of trying to pray away feelings I couldn't understand. We own our small house together, file joint tax returns, share a mortgage and a retirement plan, and the daily negotiations of two people building something permanent. Rachel's name is on my emergency contact forms at work. I'm listed as her beneficiary on her teacher's pension plan. We exist fully in each other's lives, legally and practically and emotionally, without apology or explanation. The path here wasn't without its challenges. Rachel's departure from the organization was swift and definitive once she'd made her decision. She met with the elders on a Thursday evening in late February, told them simply that she could no longer support teachings that condemned love, and walked out before they could initiate formal disciplinary proceedings. Her announcement came the following week. Rachel Morrison is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Her family's reaction was more devastating than mine had been. While my parents maintained distant but polite contact, Rachel's parents and two siblings chose complete estrangement. They returned her letters unopened, hung up when she called, treated her as if she had literally died. The pain of that rejection lingered for years, surfacing especially during holidays and family milestones that we marked alone. But we found new families, chosen families built on affection rather than obligation. Sarah, the librarian who became my closest friend during my first year of independence. Marcus and David, the couple who owned the bookstore where we spent countless Saturday afternoons and who eventually asked us to be witnesses at their wedding. Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist who helped us both process the trauma of leaving an authoritarian religious system and who became a mentor as I developed my own skills in supporting other survivors. "You know what I never expected?" Rachel said one evening last month as we prepared for our annual summer barbecue. "How normal this would all feel eventually. When I was still in the organization, leaving seemed like jumping off a cliff into complete unknown territory. I imagined that life outside would always feel precarious, unstable. And instead, this feels like the most stable thing I've ever built. This house, this community, this relationship, it's all based on choice rather than fear. Nobody's monitoring our spiritual progress or threatening to withdraw love if we make mistakes." Our barbecue guests that evening included the usual mixture of neighbors, co-workers, and friends from various chapters of our lives. Tom and Jennifer from across the street, who run a small organic farm and always bring vegetables that make our store-bought contributions seem embarrassingly inferior. Dr. Chen and her partner Lisa, fellow travelers who met during their own transitions out of restrictive religious backgrounds. Amanda, one of my clients from the community center, who successfully left an abusive marriage 2 years ago and now coordinates a support group for other women in similar situations. As I watched Rachel laugh with Tom about some disaster involving his greenhouse irrigation system, I felt the same quiet amazement that strikes me periodically. This life exists, this happiness, this belonging, this sense of being completely known and accepted. It's real, it's sustainable, and it bears no resemblance to the isolation and shame I'd been taught to expect as the inevitable result of choosing authenticity over approval. My relationship with my parents has evolved slowly over the years. The complete shunning softened gradually as they aged, and I became their only local family member. My father's diabetes requires increasing medical management, and my mother's arthritis makes daily tasks more challenging. Practical necessity has created space for limited reconnection, though conversations remain carefully neutral, avoiding topics that might resurface old conflicts. "How are things at the community center?" my mother asked during our monthly coffee meeting last week. We meet at a chain restaurant halfway between their house and mine, neutral territory that feels safer for all of us. "Busy. We're expanding our programs for people transitioning out of difficult situations. The funding came through for a new counselor position." "That's nice, dear. You always did have a heart for helping people." "It's not the relationship I once hoped we might have, but it's honest in its limitations. They can't fully accept the life I've chosen, and I can't pretend to be someone I'm not for their comfort. But within those constraints, we've found space for genuine care and limited but meaningful connection." Rachel never re-established contact with her family. The complete rejection was too absolute, too devastating to overcome. But she's made peace with that loss in ways that inspire me regularly. "I used to think family was only the people you were born to," she told me recently. "But family is really the people who choose to love you consistently, who celebrate your growth instead of demanding your conformity." Our evening routines have settled into comfortable patterns that still surprise me with their simplicity. Rachel grades papers at the kitchen table while I prepare dinner, classical music playing softly from the speakers we finally bought after years of making do with a borrowed radio. We discuss her students' progress, challenging situations I'm navigating at work, weekend plans that might include hiking, visiting the farmer's market, or simply reading together in our sun-filled living room. Sometimes former witnesses contact me through the support networks I'm part of, people in various stages of questioning or leaving who've heard that I'm available to talk. These conversations remind me how far I've traveled from the frightened woman who once begged God to remove feelings she couldn't understand. "The hardest part," a young man named Daniel told me last month, "is not knowing who I am outside the organization. I've been a witness my entire life. I don't know what my own opinions are about anything." "That's okay," I assured him. "Discovery takes time. You don't have to figure out everything at once. Start with small things. Music you like, food that makes you happy, books that interest you. Identity builds gradually. Do you ever regret leaving?" "Never. Not even during the most difficult periods. Leaving meant I could finally start living authentically. Everything good in my life now, my relationship, my work, my sense of peace, it all became possible only after I stopped trying to be someone else's version of righteous." This afternoon, Rachel and I are driving to the coast for a long weekend at a bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach. It's a trip we take annually, a tradition that began during our second year together when we realized we could travel as a couple without hiding, without explaining ourselves to suspicious hotel clerks or fellow guests. "Ready?" Rachel asks, loading our weekend bags into the car. "Almost. Let me grab the books from the counter. I've packed 2 novels, a collection of poetry, and a memoir about spiritual awakening that my therapist recommended." Rachel has brought her sketch pad and watercolors, planning to paint the dramatic Oregon coastline that never fails to remind us how beautiful the world can be when you're free to experience it fully. As we drive west through the Coast Range Mountains, I think about the journey that brought us here. The fear, the confusion, the gradual awakening to the possibility that love might be sacred regardless of its object. The painful meetings with elders who equated control with spirituality, the devastating family losses, and the surprising discoveries of new kinds of belonging. "Penny for your thoughts," Rachel says, as we wind through a particularly scenic stretch of forest. "Just thinking about how different this is from what I expected my life to look like at 62. Better or worse? Immeasurably better. More genuine, more peaceful, more connected to what actually matters. Do you think your younger self would recognize who you've become?" I consider the question seriously. That frightened pioneer who spent years begging God to make her normal, who smiled through meetings while dying inside, who believed that love was only acceptable within narrowly prescribed boundaries. Would she recognize the woman I am now? I think she would be amazed, I say finally. Not just by the external changes, but by the internal peace. By the possibility of loving completely without shame, of building a life based on authenticity rather than approval. The sun is setting as we reach the coast, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and salmon pink that seem too beautiful to be real. We check into our room at the small inn where we've stayed for the past 5 years, greeted by staff who remember our preferences and treat us with the warm professionalism they extend to all their regular guests. That evening, as we walk the beach holding hands while waves crash against the sandy shore, I feel the same sense of gratitude that surfaces regularly these days. Gratitude for the courage to choose love over fear, for the friends who supported us through difficult transitions, for the work that allows us to help others find their own paths to freedom. Emily, Rachel says, stopping to watch a group of pelicans diving for fish in the surf. Thank you. For what? For showing me what bravery looks like. For leaving first. For demonstrating that it was possible to survive outside the organization. I don't think I could have found the courage without your example. We found it together, I reply. And it's true. The courage built gradually through conversations and small acts of honesty, through supporting each other's questions and affirming each other's worth when the organization declared us worthless. As we head back to the inn, I think about the story I've just finished telling, not just to you, but to myself. It's a story of loss and discovery, of fear overcome by love, of institutional rejection, transformed into personal liberation. It's a story that continues to unfold daily in small moments of joy and connection that my younger self never imagined possible. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.